Story number 1. The Hollow of the Witch. The town of Ashwood had always felt like a place trapped in time. A place untouched by the rush of the world outside. Nestled deep in the woods, it was a town of winding roads, old houses and fields that stretched on forever. But something had changed in the years since Ethan left. He had grown up here, spent his childhood playing in the woods, running barefoot through the fields, and hearing the stories of the old people who lived in town. The stories about the witch. It was always just a tale, something to scare the children at night. But when Ethan returned to Ashwood after years away, the stories didn't seem so distant anymore. The town was different. The air was thick with something unspoken. The crops that had once flourished in the rich soil were now withering in the fields, brown and dry despite the season's rains. Livestock had begun disappearing, one by one, and no one knew where they went. Then there were the strange symbols, scratched into trees, carved into the earth, hidden in the shadows of the woods. Old runes, twisted and malformed, that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it. He had left Ashwood to escape the weight of its past, to find a life away from the whispers of ancient curses and old superstitions. But when he saw the symbols for himself, when he felt the strange coldness in the air that seemed to cling to everything, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with Ashwood, and that wrongness had been there long before his return. The town's history was steeped in rumors. They spoke of a powerful witch, a woman named Althea, who had once lived in Ashwood long before the first settlers arrived. She had been feared, hated, and eventually driven out by the people who once followed her. But her power, they said, had never really left. Althea had cursed the land, binding her essence to it in such a way that even death could not free her. Her power lingered, passed from generation to generation, seeping into the very soil beneath their feet. The more Ethan dug into the history, the more unsettling it became. Old journals, dusty books, and hushed conversations led him to a chilling realization. The witch was not simply a ghost or a shadow of the past. She had never left. She was alive in the land itself, woven into the very bones of Ashwood. Her presence was a part of the town, a living, breathing entity that had been manipulating its people for as long as anyone could remember. The deeper Ethan went, the more he began to lose touch with what was real. Memories of his own childhood seemed to twist, bending under the weight of new truths. Faces of people he had known, people he thought had disappeared or died, appeared in dreams, their eyes dark and hollow. They whispered to him, told him things he wasn't sure he could believe. The witch had been waiting for him. She had been waiting for someone who could hear her, someone who would return to Ashwood and break the veil that separated her from the world. As he ventured into the woods, following the trail of symbols, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The trees whispered in the wind, but it wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was something more. A voice, the witch's voice. The air grew thick with her presence, and Ethan began to feel the pull of something ancient and terrible, something that had been lying in wait for him all along. Ethan's heart raced as he found himself standing before the hollow, a deep, yawning pit at the center of the woods. The air around it hummed with a low, vibrating energy, and the ground was slick with something that felt like blood. Symbols were carved into the trees surrounding it, their meanings as twisted as the land itself. The hollow was where it all began, where Althea had made her curse. And now, standing at its edge, Ethan understood. He wasn't just investigating the witch. He was becoming part of her curse. The memories he thought he had known, the people he had once loved, were slipping away, replaced by something darker. The witch's influence had taken root in him too. The line between what was real and what had been twisted by her power began to blur, and he could no longer trust his own mind. In that moment, Ethan realized there was no escaping Ashwood. There was no running from the witch. She was in the land, in the air, in his blood. Her influence had been waiting, watching, and now it had him. As the woods closed in around him and the whispers of the past grew louder, Ethan understood that the hollow was not just a place. It was a part of him now. And in Ashwood, once the witch claimed you, you could never truly leave. Story number 2. The Sorceress of Waverly Manor. Dr. James Armitage had spent his life studying folklore. A renowned historian, he had built a reputation on his ability to uncover the truths hidden behind ancient legends. It was this reputation that had brought him to Waverly Manor, a decaying mansion tucked away in the English countryside. The place had been abandoned for centuries, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered, but the stories surrounding it had never died. Local legends spoke of a witch, an ancient sorceress who had once lived in Waverly Manor. They said she had commanded the land itself, bending the trees and the very earth to her will. In the dead of night, her dark magic was said to be so potent that it could summon storms, stir the winds, and drive men mad with fear. She had vanished from the records centuries ago, but the whispers remained. Some claimed her spirit still lingered in the ruins, her power unbroken by time. When the invitation arrived, Armitage could not refuse. He was drawn to the idea of uncovering more about the witch's past. The manor was a piece of history, and to study it was a rare opportunity that would surely add to his legacy. He arrived at Waverly Manor in the early morning, the fog still thick in the air. The house loomed like a forgotten specter on the hill, its outline barely visible through the mist. The manor had once been grand, but now it was little more than a shadow of its former self, the stone walls worn with age and neglect. As Armitage began his exploration, he felt an eerie sense of being watched. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing and shifting around him. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creaking of the rotting floorboards under his feet. He ventured deeper into the house, his flashlight flickering as he moved from room to room, each more decayed than the last. The wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the once magnificent chandeliers hung crookedly from the ceiling, as if they had been abandoned in haste. It was in the library that Armitage first found something strange. Amidst the dust-covered shelves, there was a journal, an old leather-bound book that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. He opened it, the pages brittle, yet the ink still clear and sharp. The journal belonged to the witch, the sorceress of Waverly Manor. It detailed her practices, her rituals, and her growing power over the land. As Armitage read, he could feel the weight of her presence in the room. The more he read, the more the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift, as though the very air had become charged with dark energy. That night, as he lay in the manor's cold, neglected bed, he began to have strange dreams. At first, they were fleeting. Images of shadows moving in the corners of his vision, whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. But as the nights wore on, the dreams grew more vivid, more disturbing. He saw the witch standing in the center of a dark, swirling storm, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. She would call to him in a voice that was both seductive and terrifying, urging him to join her, to embrace the power that she had once wielded. The line between his dreams and reality began to blur. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that he had heard footsteps in the hallway, or that a cold, unseen hand had brushed against his skin. At times, he could swear that he saw the witch's face in the mirror, her smile twisted and cruel, watching him with eyes that seemed to burn with ancient knowledge. The more Armitage studied the journal, the more he uncovered about the witch's rituals. It became clear that her magic had not died with her. It had merely gone dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And that moment, he realized with growing horror, had come. The house itself seemed to be responding to his presence, the walls closing in around him as if the manor were alive, breathing with the same dark energy that had once pulsed through the witch's veins. Days turned into weeks, and Armitage found himself unable to leave. The manor had ensnared him, its dark influence growing stronger with each passing hour. The witch's presence was all around him now. Her whispers, her laughter, her touch. He could no longer tell if he was losing his mind or if the witch had truly returned, her spirit woven into the very fabric of the house. His final night in Waverly Manor was the most terrifying of all. As he descended into the depths of the manor, seeking answers, he found himself standing before a hidden door, one that had been sealed for centuries. When he opened it, the stench of decay hit him, and the air felt thick with magic. Inside was a stone altar, blackened and cracked, the remnants of a ritual long abandoned. And there, in the center of the room, was the witch's final resting place. Her body had long since decomposed, but her spirit was not gone. It was still there, swirling in the air around him, a presence he could not escape. Armitage's mind fractured as the truth sank in. He had not come to uncover the witch's past, he had come to awaken her. And now, as the witch's spirit wrapped around him, he understood that there was no escape. The line between his own thoughts and the witch's dark influence had vanished, and as her power consumed him, he realized that Waverly Manor had claimed yet another soul to join its endless haunted history. In the end, Dr. James Armitage became nothing more than a whisper in the walls of Waverly Manor. Another victim of the sorceress's eternal curse. Story number 3. The Witch of the Tides. When Claire Holloway arrived in the small coastal town of Marlow Bay, she felt like she had finally found the fresh start she'd been looking for. The kind of place where you could leave your past behind, where the air smelled of salt and seaweed, and where time seemed to slow, allowing her to breathe again. She had rented a small cottage by the cliffs, far enough from the town center to feel secluded, but close enough to hear the gentle rush of the waves. It was perfect, or at least it seemed so at first. Marlow Bay had an old charm to it, the kind of place that had been untouched by modern life. Its cobbled streets and weathered buildings gave it a sense of history, but there was something unsettling beneath the surface. Claire hadn't been in town for long when she began to notice it. The weather was too predictable. The days would start bright, the sun strong in the sky, but as evening approached, the winds would pick up, dark clouds would roll in, and the storms would hit. They were fierce, with lightning that cracked the sky and rain that came down in sheets, only to disappear by morning. The pattern was always the same, the storms timed with uncanny precision. The locals didn't seem to mind, almost as if they were used to it. They went about their daily lives as though nothing was out of the ordinary. Claire, however, began to feel the weight of the storms pressing down on her. They felt too controlled, too deliberate. It was as if the tides themselves were being manipulated by some unseen force. One evening, after a particularly violent storm had passed, Claire met an elderly woman in the market. She was bent over a basket of fish, her hands trembling, but her eyes were sharp, piercing and knowing. Her name was Agnes, and as they exchanged pleasantries, Agnes took Claire aside, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're new here, aren't you?" Agnes asked, her gaze darting to the waves crashing against the rocks in the distance. "You've felt it, haven't you? The storm's pull? It's not natural, you know." Claire was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "The tides," Agnes continued, her voice thick with secrecy. They're controlled by her, the witch of the tides. She's the one who keeps the storms coming, keeps us all bound to her will. At first, Claire thought Agnes was simply a local who had lived too long in the town's isolated atmosphere. But there was something in the old woman's eyes that unsettled her. Something that made her think there might be more truth to her words than she was willing to admit. The next few days only deepened Claire's suspicions. She began to overhear hushed conversations in the town square, murmurs of an ancient witch who had once lived in Marlow Bay, a woman who had made a pact with the sea itself. The witch had bound the town to an endless cycle of storms, keeping the town safe from harm, but at a terrible cost. The people of Marlow Bay were trapped in an illusion, living their lives in false peace while the witch's power controlled everything around them. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone, or something, was pulling her into a web she didn't understand. Her nights were filled with restless dreams of storm-lashed seas and dark figures moving through the fog. She saw flashes of a woman, tall and cloaked in shadow, standing on the edge of a cliff, her arms raised toward the sky. The woman's face was always obscured, but Claire could feel the weight of her gaze, a force that seemed to draw her closer to the sea. One evening, as a particularly violent storm raged outside, Claire couldn't resist the pull any longer. She left her cottage and made her way down to the beach, the wind howling in her ears. The storm seemed to welcome her, the waves crashing higher and higher as she approached the water's edge. It was there, standing on the rocky shore, that she saw her, the witch of the tides. The witch was tall, her figure cloaked in dark robes that swirled with the mist. Her face was pale, her eyes glowing with a supernatural light. She was watching Claire, her presence overwhelming and suffocating. Claire tried to speak, but no words came out. She was paralyzed by the witch's gaze, by the undeniable power that radiated from her. "You're here because I called you," the witch said, her voice like the crash of waves against the rocks. "You are the key to breaking the curse, Claire. The curse that binds this town to the endless cycle of storms." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. "I don't understand. Why me?" The witch smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "Because you are the one who can set us free. You are the one who will bring an end to the storms. But there is a price, of course. There always is." The witch extended her hand toward Claire, and in that moment Claire understood. The price wasn't just her life. It was her soul, her essence, her very being. To break the curse, to free the town, she would have to surrender everything she was, everything she hoped to become. Claire hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could feel the storm swirling inside her, the power of the tides calling to her, offering her a chance to rewrite the fate of the town. But at what cost? The witch was not a being who dealt in charity. There was no way to break the curse without sacrificing something, someone precious. In the end, Claire made her choice. She stepped forward, reaching for the witch's hand, and as their fingers met, the storm exploded around them, the thunder deafening in her ears. She felt the witch's power surge through her, pulling her under, drowning her in the very tides she had come to understand. And when the storm finally passed, Marlow Bay was calm. The sky was clear, the waves gentle against the shore. But somewhere, deep beneath the surface, Claire's soul remained trapped, bound to the tides for all eternity. The witch had her price, and Claire had paid it, leaving the town to continue its quiet existence, unaware of the true cost of its peace. As for Claire, she was now part of the storm, part of the curse that would never end. Story number 4. The Book of the Witch. Dr. Nathaniel Graves had spent his entire academic career immersed in the occult. A scholar of ancient texts and forgotten rituals, He had always been drawn to the mysteries of the past, particularly the darker corners of human history. His colleagues often joked that his interest in the macabre was unhealthy, but to Nathaniel, it was simply a passion, one that had consumed him for years. It was while combing through an old library in a small, forgotten university town that Nathaniel came across it, the manuscript. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of the library's archives, hidden between ancient scrolls and neglected volumes. The book was old, older than anything he had ever seen. Its cover was worn and cracked, but the binding was still intact. The pages inside were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded but legible. A single word was scrawled on the first page in jagged, archaic script: "The Book of the Witch." Nathaniel's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. The manuscript detailed the ritual of a witch from a long-forgotten era, a woman who had mastered the dark arts and sought to summon a cosmic entity, a being of unimaginable power that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The witch's ritual, the text explained, required precise steps, each more harrowing than the last. But there was one catch. The final step required a sacrifice, a soul to be offered to the entity, a soul to open the gateway for it to enter this world. The idea of it intrigued Nathaniel. The dark rituals of the past had always fascinated him, but this was something different. The witch had been close to completing her ritual, but something had interrupted her. The manuscript was unfinished, with no indication of whether or not the sacrifice had been made. Nathaniel's fingers trembled as he translated the text, piecing together the fragmented instructions. He felt a strange compulsion, as if the words themselves were calling to him, urging him to continue. As the days passed, Nathaniel's obsession with the manuscript grew. He couldn't stop translating, couldn't stop reading. The witch's words haunted him, each phrase more unnerving than the last. The ritual was never completed, and yet there were hints, dark, subtle hints, that someone had tried to finish it. Someone had begun the process once more, unwittingly setting the pieces of the ritual into motion again. The visions began shortly after he had deciphered the final page. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow in the corner of his vision, something he could never quite grasp. But as he continued his work, the shadows grew darker, more distinct. He saw her, the witch, standing in the doorway of his study, her eyes hollow, her face twisted with a madness born of the powers she had dared to summon. Her mouth moved, but Nathaniel could never hear the words. She would appear in his dreams too, always in the same place. A cold, dark forest, the moon obscured by thick clouds, and in the distance the faintest glimmer of something enormous, something incomprehensible. But it wasn't just the witch. The visions of the monstrous entity she had summoned began to invade his waking hours. He could feel its presence in the room with him, a cold, oppressive weight that filled the air. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into a void that stretched endlessly into nothingness. He could hear it. Whispers, soft at first, but growing louder and louder until they became a maddening cacophony. The entity, whatever it was, wanted to cross over. It wanted to enter this world. And Nathaniel had unknowingly begun the process. The more he translated, the more he realized the consequences of his curiosity. The witch's ritual had been incomplete, but now, with his research, he had unknowingly provided the final pieces. He had crossed the threshold. The entity was stirring, waking, and the sacrifice was required. Nathaniel tried to stop. He burned the manuscript, tore it to pieces, but it didn't matter. The visions didn't stop. The witch's face continued to appear in his dreams, her twisted grin a constant reminder of what he had set into motion. The whispers grew louder, filling every corner of his mind. He could no longer tell if the world around him was real or just another fragment of the madness he had summoned. It was only then that Nathaniel understood. The ritual was not something that could be undone. The witch had not completed it because she had been stopped. Perhaps she had been caught. Perhaps she had feared the entity, but whatever the reason, she had left the door open just a crack. And now, Nathaniel had widened that crack. He was the sacrifice. He had become the soul required to complete the ritual. The night of the final storm, when the winds howled and the air grew thick with an unnatural cold, Nathaniel stood in the center of his study, staring at the window. He could see it now, through the glass, through the darkness. Something vast, something impossibly large. A shape that defied comprehension, hovering just beyond the veil of reality. Its eyes were everywhere, staring at him from the shadows, from the very fabric of his mind. As the first tendril of the entity's presence slipped through the window, wrapping around him, Nathaniel finally understood the truth. He had become part of the ritual. His curiosity had been his undoing. His desire for knowledge, the very thing that had damned him. The witch had been a warning, but he had ignored it. Now, there would be no turning back. The final whispers came, not from the witch, but from the entity itself, deep, rumbling, ancient. They filled Nathaniel's mind, his body, his very soul, until he could no longer tell where he ended and it began. And as the room grew cold, as the shadows stretched and merged into one, Nathaniel realized with horror that he had not only discovered the truth of the witch's ritual, he had become part of it, and the dark force that had been waiting beyond the stars had finally entered this world. There would be no escaping the consequences of his academic curiosity. Story number 5. The Witches of Grimoire Woods. It started like any other adventure, an innocent hike into the woods, the kind of thing you do when you're young, eager to explore, and a little too confident about how well you know the world. There were 5 of us that day: Tom, Sarah, Laura, Ben and me, Jack. We'd been friends for years, bound by our shared love of the outdoors and the stories we would swap around campfires. It was a weekend trip, a short getaway to clear our minds, but it turned into something none of us would ever forget. Grimoire Woods was the kind of place that felt old even before you stepped into it. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches weaving together like a net to block out the sun. There were no birds singing, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just the quiet, oppressive silence of a place that had long forgotten the presence of men. We'd been walking for hours, just following the worn path that cut through the woods, when we stumbled upon something we hadn't expected. A village. It wasn't marked on any of our maps, and we hadn't seen any signs of human life since we'd entered the forest. The village was tucked deep within the trees, hidden away, as if the forest itself had tried to keep it secret. The houses were small, their wood dark and weathered, and the streets were narrow, overgrown with ivy and moss. It looked like something out of a forgotten time, like a village from centuries ago, untouched by the modern world. But it was the people who made it strange. The villagers, all women, were dressed in clothing that looked out of place, as if they had stepped out of a history book. Long, flowing dresses, heavy shawls and bonnets that hid their faces. They didn't seem surprised to see us, didn't show any sign of being startled by our sudden appearance. Instead, they watched us with calm, unreadable eyes, their expressions frozen in something between curiosity and expectation. It didn't take long for us to realize something was off. The women didn't age, at least not in the way we understood it. There was something strange about their eyes, something ageless about them. They didn't speak much, but when they did, their voices were smooth and unnervingly calm. They invited us into their homes, offered us food and drink, and showed us hospitality that felt too perfect, like they had been waiting for us. We were still unsure of what to make of it all when Sarah noticed something that made her stomach churn. There were no men, not a single one, not in the village, not in the surrounding woods, and there were no children either. Just the women, always together, always with the same blank expressions, never leaving the village, never interacting with the outside world. At first, we chalked it up to odd coincidence, but the longer we stayed, the more it became clear there was something wrong with this place, and something wrong with the women. We tried to leave the village, but the woods seemed to shift around us. Every path we took led us back to the village, the same houses, the same faces, the same unsettling silence. It was like the forest itself was closing in on us, trapping us within its walls. That night, as we sat around a fire outside one of the houses, a woman, the oldest among them, came to speak with us. She was tall and thin, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were sharp, piercing. She told us the truth in a voice that sounded too old, too worn for a human to speak. "We have lived here for centuries," she said, her voice a soft, raspy whisper. "Bound to the land, bound to each other, bound to the pact we made long ago." "A pact?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she continued, "a pact with an eldritch being, a creature of darkness who lives beneath the earth, beyond time. We serve it, and in return, we are given immortality, the gift of eternal life. But it comes at a price." We stared at her, not knowing what to say. "The village itself is a trap," she continued, her eyes flicking over each of us. "The forest is its keeper, and it does not let souls leave once they've entered. You are here now, and you will never leave. You will become part of the cycle. You will become like us." I felt a chill run through me, and I saw it mirrored in my friend's eyes. We were being watched by the others, who had gathered silently around the fire, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in something beyond human understanding. They were waiting. "Why us?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you bring us here?" The woman smiled, but it was a smile that held no warmth. "We didn't bring you here. You came because you were meant to. The land calls to those it needs, those who wander too far into the woods, those who are drawn to the forgotten places, and now you are ours, forever." We tried to run the next day, all of us. We bolted out of the village, pushing through the thick forest, but no matter which direction we took, we always ended up back in the village. The houses seemed to shift, the paths twisted, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't escape. The forest had become a maze, and it had no exit. One by one, the village took us. First, Ben disappeared, then Sarah, then Laura. They were taken without a sound, without a struggle, and no matter how much I called for them, there was no answer. Only the haunting laughter of the witches echoing through the trees. I'm the last one now. I know what's coming. I can feel it. The land is hungry, and it's waiting for me to accept my place among them, to accept the pact. The witch women, timeless, ageless, have already claimed my friends, and soon they will claim me. I can't leave, none of us can. The village of Grimoire Woods is an eternal trap, and I have become part of it, a soul lost to the forest, bound by the witch's pact, forever wandering through the fog with no way out. And I know, in the end, there will always be new wanderers, new souls to replace the ones they've taken. The cycle will never end. Story number 6. The Last Witch Hunt. The town of Black Hollow had always been a place of whispers and old stories, tucked away in the hills where the modern world hadn't quite reached. The town wasn't on any major roads, not listed in tourist guides, and for the most part, people who lived there liked it that way. It had its traditions, its secrets, and the locals preferred it all to stay as quiet and hidden as the mist that settled over the town every morning. But then, the murders began. At first, it was just one. A body was found near the woods, mutilated in ways that made the local police uncomfortable. There were no signs of struggle, no clues, just a violent end. Fingers ripped from the hands, strange symbols carved into the skin. The town sheriff, a man who had lived in Black Hollow his whole life, thought it might be an isolated incident, a random act of violence, maybe a crime of passion. But when the second body appeared, the same mutilations, the same symbols, he couldn't deny it any longer. Something dark was happening in the town. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. People began to speak in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders when they mentioned her name. Eva Sinclair, the last witch of Black Hollow. She was an older woman now, long past the prime of her youth when the stories of her magic had been whispered in the town's corners. But Eva had always been a part of Black Hollow's folklore. The locals had grown used to her oddities, her strange ways, her solitary life, the way she would disappear into the woods for days at a time, but they'd never thought much of it. In a town like Black Hollow, oddness was just part of the charm. But when the killings continued, people began to connect the dots. Eva had always been rumored to practice dark magic, and now, as the bodies piled up, the town's suspicions began to turn into accusations. Her strange habits, her old books, her isolation, everything was now seen through the lens of fear. The town needed someone to blame, and Eva was the obvious choice. Detective Noah Carter had been called in from the county to investigate the murders. He wasn't a local, didn't share the town's superstitions. He was methodical, practical, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained with evidence. He had heard the rumors, but he dismissed them. He had seen plenty of brutal crimes, but this wasn't the kind of case he was used to. He assumed it was the work of some twisted individual or group. A serial killer, perhaps. But the more he investigated, the more he realized this was no ordinary crime. The deeper Noah dug, the more strange things began to surface. The town's history was littered with references to witchcraft and dark rituals, but it wasn't the kind of thing Noah could easily dismiss. Old records, church ledgers, even whispers in the local bar told of witches who had once lived in Black Hollow, of blood pacts and ceremonies held under the cover of darkness. But the most chilling thing he found was the pattern of the murders. They followed an ancient ritualistic structure, one that seemed to trace back centuries. The victims were chosen in a specific way, and the symbols left on their bodies were not random. They were part of something far older, something that felt wrong in a way Noah couldn't quite explain. The town's whispers about Eva began to take root in his mind. He met her one evening, at the edge of the woods where she lived, in a small, decrepit cabin that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Eva had aged, but there was something about her that was unsettling. Her eyes were sharp, and her smile thin, like someone who knew secrets the world was too afraid to uncover. She invited Noah inside, and for a moment, he thought he could hear the low hum of something beneath the floorboards, something alive. It wasn't long before Eva began to speak, as if she already knew what he was thinking. "You think I'm behind the killings, don't you?" she said, her voice soft but steady. Noah didn't answer. He simply watched her. "I never asked for this," she continued, her eyes distant, "but it's my burden to bear. You'll see that soon enough." Eva's words haunted Noah for days. She never once denied the accusations, never once said she wasn't involved. But the way she spoke, so calm, so resigned, made Noah wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more truth in the rumors than he had been willing to admit. He began to piece together the ritual, the symbols, and the timeline of the murders. It all led back to one thing: Ava's power, her dark magic. It was real, and it was ancient. As the full moon rose over Black Hollow, Noah followed his instincts into the heart of the forest. The air was thick with fog, and the further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. He knew he was being watched. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, and his breath came quicker with every shadow that passed by. He finally reached the clearing, the place where the rituals had once been performed. In the center of it stood an altar, ancient and weathered, but unmistakable. There, in the center of the clearing, was Eva. She was no longer the woman he had met in her cabin. She stood taller, her presence more commanding, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Around her were the symbols of the ritual, the marks of the pact she had made so long ago. Eva had been bound to a dark force, a being beyond understanding, and it had taken her this long to finally complete the ritual. "The ritual is almost finished, Noah," Eva said, her voice echoing through the trees. "But you're here now, and that changes things." The realization hit Noah like a blow. He had walked straight into the heart of it, the heart of the evil that had been pulling the strings in Black Hollow all along. Eva's power, her magic, was tied to something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer investigating the murders. He was part of the ritual now. He was the final sacrifice. As the last words of the incantation were spoken, the ground beneath Noah trembled. The darkness, the evil that had been locked away for centuries, began to seep into the world. And Noah knew in that moment that Black Hollow had never truly been free. It had always been waiting for someone to complete the witch's pact, to open the door. The last thing Noah saw was Eva's smile, thin and knowing, before everything went black. Black Hollow was no longer just a town, it was a doorway. And now, the witch's power would reign once more. Story number 7. The Witch in the Walls. When Mark and Sarah Mitchell found the old mansion on the outskirts of the small countryside town, they saw only the beauty of it. A sprawling Victorian house with ivy creeping up its sides, set against a backdrop of dark, dense woods. It was isolated, hidden from the world, and that's exactly what they had been looking for. They both wanted a fresh start, away from the noise of the city, and this seemed like the perfect escape. The house had been abandoned for years, and the price was almost too good to be true. The realtor had mentioned a few things. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual history of a place like this. He had mentioned the town's distant past, the strange rumors about the house, but Mark and Sarah hadn't paid much attention. The house was theirs now, and that's all that mattered. From the moment they stepped inside, there was a coldness to the place, an unease that crept into their bones. The air was thick with dust, and the rooms felt oddly empty despite the old furniture left behind. But it was a beautiful house, even in its decay. The grand staircase, the high ceilings, the intricate moldings. Everything seemed like it had once been part of a place that held great importance. The first night they stayed, they didn't sleep well. It wasn't the house itself, but the unsettling quiet. No sounds of the wind, no birds, no animals. Just silence. And then there were the whispers. At first, it was easy to dismiss them, just the house settling, the wind brushing against the walls. But the whispers were persistent, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. By the second day, Sarah had begun to notice strange things. Figures, out of the corner of her eye, shifting in the shadows of the hallways. At first, she thought it was just fatigue, but when it happened again, this time in the kitchen, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She told Mark, but he laughed it off as stress. It had been a long drive, The house was old, nothing to worry about. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. Something ancient and oppressive. And then it started happening to Mark too. One night, as he was walking down the hallway, he saw a figure standing at the end of the corridor. A woman, her face obscured by a hood, standing perfectly still. When he blinked, she was gone. The house seemed to be shifting, changing. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They began to hear their names spoken softly in the dark. Sarah. Mark. It was as though someone, or something, was calling them. And it wasn't just the whispers. They began to find strange symbols carved into the walls, etched into the wood, hidden beneath layers of paint. Some of the symbols were familiar, others were not. But they all felt wrong. They felt like something that should not be here. Unable to ignore it any longer, Sarah began to research the house's history. It didn't take long for her to find the town's old records, buried deep in the local archives. The mansion had once belonged to a woman named Eliza Thorne, a woman who had been accused of witchcraft hundreds of years ago. The townspeople had executed her for her alleged crimes, burned her at the stake. But the records hinted at something darker. They spoke of a curse, of a ritual she had performed in the house before her death. A ritual meant to bind her soul to the land forever. The more Sarah dug, the more she found. The ritual had been a pact with a dark force, an ancient being, something older than the town itself. Eliza had wanted to live forever, to bend the world to her will, and in her desperation she had used the house to tie herself to that force. But it hadn't gone as planned. The ritual had been incomplete, leaving Eliza's soul trapped in the walls of the mansion. The town had thought they had destroyed her, but in reality, they had only imprisoned her. Sarah shared her findings with Mark, but he didn't want to believe it. He tried to dismiss it, but the evidence was mounting. The house itself seemed to be alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy that couldn't be ignored. And then they found the altar. It was hidden in the basement, behind a false wall, a small, secret room. The altar was made of stone, old and cracked, with remnants of candles and strange markings surrounding it. And on the floor, in the center of the room, was a circle of salt, still undisturbed. It was clear to Sarah now, Eliza had never left. The ritual had never been completed, and now the house was hungry for the souls of those who dared to live within it. The whispers had become screams, and the shadows no longer hid in the corners. They came for Mark and Sarah now, circling them, filling the air with dread. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor creaked as if the house itself was moving, twisting, reaching for them. They were trapped. The house was alive, and Eliza Thorne's curse had been waiting for them, waiting for someone to finish what she had started. In the dead of night, when the whispers were unbearable, Mark and Sarah knew they had no choice. They had to leave. But as they tried to escape, they realized the truth. The house wouldn't let them go. The door that had once been open was now sealed shut, and the windows were nothing but glass. The house had claimed them, and there was no way out. The last thing they heard, as the darkness closed in, was Eliza's voice, soft and triumphant, whispering from the walls, "You are mine now." And so, the house stood silent once more, waiting for the next souls to wander in, drawn by its promises of peace and escape, only to become part of the curse, part of the witch in the walls. Story number 8. The Witch's Eye. Lena had always been drawn to old things, antique shops, estate sales, and forgotten corners of dusty bookstores. Those were her favorite places to visit, where she could sift through relics of the past. When she stumbled upon the old mirror at a small, cluttered antique store just outside town, she felt an inexplicable pull. The mirror was large, framed in dark wood, carved with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. The glass was slightly cloudy, but there was something about it that felt alive. The shopkeeper didn't seem eager to sell it, his eyes lingering on it with an odd mixture of reluctance and fear. But the price was low, and Lena, intrigued, bought it on impulse. At first, the mirror was just a decorative piece in her apartment. It stood against the far wall of her bedroom, its surface catching the light in a way that made it seem almost enchanting. But as the days passed, Lena began to notice something strange. The mirror seemed to change. It wasn't anything she could explain, but when she looked into it, her reflection didn't always look like her. Sometimes her features were distorted, elongated, twisted into monstrous shapes, as if something dark were trying to emerge from within her. At night, the reflections grew worse. Her face would appear pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and black, her mouth contorted into a grotesque smile. Lena would turn away, heart racing, convinced she was imagining things, but the next time she looked, it would be the same. The mirror had shown her truth, something she couldn't escape. The disturbances didn't stop with the mirror. Shadows seemed to move on their own in her apartment, creeping along the walls like living things. She heard whispers late at night, voices too soft to make out, but filled with an unmistakable malice. Objects would shift when she wasn't looking. Small things at first, like a chair moved out of place, or a book fallen from its shelf. But the more time she spent in the apartment, the stronger the sense that something was there with her, something that wasn't quite human. Desperate to rid herself of whatever curse she had unknowingly invited into her life, Lena sought help. She went to an occult expert named Dr. Richard Halloway, a man known for his deep knowledge of the paranormal. When she told him about the mirror, his face turned pale, and he grew uncomfortably still. "You've found it," he said in a low voice, his eyes wide with dread. "The witch's eye." Dr. Halloway explained that the mirror had once belonged to a notorious witch, known only as Mora, who had lived centuries ago. Mora had been a powerful sorceress, feared by many in her time. It was said that she could peer into the soul of anyone who gazed into her mirror, revealing not just their outer appearance, but the very essence of their being. But Mora's magic came at a terrible cost. In the end, she was executed by the townspeople, but not before she had bound her spirit to the mirror, trapping herself inside the glass for eternity. The mirror, Dr. Halloway continued, is more than just a reflection. It's a conduit. Mora's spirit is trapped there, and it feeds off the souls of those who look into it. Over time, she begins to take control. The more you look, the more she will take, until she becomes you. Lena felt her stomach twist. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but everything that had been happening to her, the strange reflections, the whispers, the growing sense of dread, began to make sense in a horrifying way. She was being consumed, piece by piece, by the witch's spirit. Dr. Halloway warned her that breaking the curse wouldn't be easy. The witch's power had grown strong over the centuries, and the longer Lena kept the mirror, the harder it would be to free herself. But there was a way. He spoke of an ancient ritual, one that required not just strength of will, but a willingness to sacrifice a part of herself, her very soul. Lena didn't care. She was desperate. She agreed to perform the ritual, hoping to rid herself of the mirror and the witch's power for good. But as the ritual began, she felt something shift deep within her, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror, once cold and distant, began to hum with energy. Its surface rippled like water, and Lena's reflection grinned back at her in a way that felt wrong. She fought against the growing power within her, the cold sensation spreading through her veins. But it was too late. The witch's spirit had already begun to take root in her body. Lena's hands shook as she completed the final words of the ritual, but she felt the witch's presence pressing down on her, wrapping around her like a cloak. Her reflection in the mirror changed again, no longer just a twisted version of herself. It was Mora now, her eyes black and hollow, her smile wide and sinister. The witch had taken her. Lena stumbled back from the mirror, gasping for air, but it was no use. The ritual had failed. Mora's spirit had not been banished. It had already overtaken her, claiming her body, her mind, her soul. The last thing Lena saw before the darkness consumed her completely was the reflection of her own face, grinning back at her with the same monstrous smile she had seen so many times before. And in that smile, Lena understood the truth. She was no longer Lena. She was Mora, the witch in the glass, and she would live on forever, feeding on the souls of those who came too close to the mirror. The witch's eye would never be closed. Story number 9. The Witch and the King. Alden of the Kingdom of Luther was a man who had seen the worst of what life could offer. His people were starving, the land barren, and every crop that was planted seemed to wither and die under a relentless sun. The once prosperous kingdom had become a shadow of itself, and the cries of hungry children filled the air. For years, Alden had tried everything: trade agreements, alliances, even prayer. But nothing had worked. The famine only grew worse. As desperation consumed him, the king remembered the old stories, the tales of an ancient witch who lived in the deepest part of the dark forest. It was said she could control the elements, bend the earth to her will, and heal any wound, no matter how deep. But there was always a price. The price was not gold nor riches. It was something much darker. The price was the soul of whoever sought her aid. In the dead of night, when the moon hung low and the stars barely pierced the heavy clouds, King Alden set out to find her. He didn't tell anyone, not even his closest advisors. He knew the people would never understand. To save them, he would do anything, even sacrifice himself. After days of searching, he found her, a woman draped in robes as dark as the night itself, standing at the edge of a clearing. Her eyes were as black as coal, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. She did not speak when Alden approached, but he could feel the weight of her presence, as if she could see straight into his soul. "I know why you've come," the witch said, her voice smooth like silk, but there was something unnatural about it, something that sent a chill down Alden's spine. "You want to save your people, but everything comes at a cost, King Alden." The king fell to his knees, desperation flooding his heart. "Please," he begged, his voice thick with emotion. "I will do anything. My people are dying. I cannot stand by and watch them suffer." The witch studied him for a long moment, her black eyes piercing into him. Finally, she spoke again, her voice colder now. "There is a spell I can cast. It will bring rain, heal the land, and fill your people's bellies. Your kingdom will flourish once more. But in return, I require your soul, your essence, your humanity." Alden hesitated for only a moment. The thought of what he was being asked to give up lingered in his mind, but it quickly faded. His people were starving, and they depended on him. What was his soul compared to their lives? "I accept," he said, his voice steady, despite the dread he felt. The witch smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "So be it." With a gesture of her hand, the air around them seemed to thicken, the ground beneath them rumbling as if the earth itself were waking from a deep slumber. A strange wind blew through the clearing, carrying the scent of damp earth and something far older, something malevolent. The witch muttered an incantation under her breath, her voice rising in power, and the very sky above seemed to darken in response. As the spell took hold, Alden felt something leave him. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something he couldn't fully understand. He could feel the weight of his own humanity slipping away, replaced by something cold and empty. It was as though a part of him was being torn out, never to return. When the spell was complete, the witch stood back, her face expressionless. The clouds above parted, and the rain began to fall, steady and life-giving. The land responded almost immediately. Crops began to sprout, rivers flowed once more, and the once parched earth drank in the moisture greedily. The kingdom was saved. At first, it seemed like a miracle. The people rejoiced, praising their king for bringing them salvation. But soon, strange things began to happen. Alden's appearance began to change. His skin grew paler, his eyes darker. His hair, once dark and thick, began to thin and turn white. He no longer felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, nor the joy of a good meal. He could no longer feel the love of his people, the connection to those he had sworn to protect. His mind began to warp as well. He became more distant, more ruthless, and cruel. The laughter of his people, once a source of joy, now grated on his nerves. He grew impatient with them, and the smiles that had once lit up his face faded into a cold, emotionless mask. His kingdom thrived, yes, but it was not the kingdom he had known. It was something else. Something dark, twisted, and unnatural, and the witch's hold on him grew stronger. Alden could feel her presence, always lurking just out of sight, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. The kingdom was hers now, not his. She had bound them all to her will with the spell, and as his transformation continued, he realized that he wasn't just losing his humanity. He was becoming something else entirely, something monstrous. One night, while wandering the halls of his castle, Alden had a vision, no, a revelation. He saw himself, but not as he was. He saw the king he had been, the man full of compassion and hope, standing next to the witch, watching as the kingdom burned. He saw the people he had once loved, their faces twisted in agony as they were consumed by the curse that had taken root in the land. He saw the future he had doomed them to. He knew then that the witch's magic was not just upon him, it was upon them all. His people were bound to her as much as he was, their souls intertwined with his, their fates sealed by the bargain he had struck. And there was no escape, no salvation. The witch had taken everything from him, and now she would take everything from them. The kingdom flourished, but it was a kingdom of shadows. The rain fell, but it was a cold, unfeeling rain. The crops grew, but they were twisted, unnatural. And the people, though they had food in their bellies, were hollow, their joy replaced by a creeping, gnawing fear. They were all prisoners, bound to the witch's will, trapped in a kingdom that was no longer theirs. King Alden stood on the balcony of his castle, gazing out over his land. He could no longer remember the warmth of his people's love, the hope he had once had. All he could feel now was the witch's presence, cold and suffocating, wrapping around him like a vice. And he knew in that moment that there would be no escape for him or for them. The witch had won, and the kingdom was hers forever. Story number 10. The Witch's Garden. Benjamin hadn't planned to stay at the Rosewood estate for long. He had taken the job as a gardener out of necessity, hoping to save up enough money to return to the city where he could pursue something more meaningful. The estate was vast, and the work was steady, but it was lonely. Isolated in the countryside, far from civilization. Still, he was content. He had a roof over his head, and the estate's owner, a wealthy widow named Mrs. Blackwell, was kind enough to provide him with a small cottage at the edge of the property. It was all he needed. One afternoon, while trimming hedges near the outer boundaries of the garden, Benjamin noticed something strange. There was a path he had never seen before, winding behind a tall stone wall that seemed older than the rest of the estate. The air around it felt thicker, cooler, as if the ground itself was holding a secret. The path led to a heavy wooden gate overgrown with vines. It was partially open, just enough for someone to slip through. His curiosity got the better of him. He stepped through the gate and into the hidden garden. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. The garden was unlike anything he had ever seen. Lush, yes, but with an unnatural vibrancy. The plants were thick with twisting vines and flowers that shimmered in shades of red, purple, and black. But it wasn't the color that caught Benjamin's attention. It was the movement. The leaves of the plants seemed to shift, as though they were breathing. Vines twitched in the air like the fingers of a hand. The flowers pulsed, their petals expanding and contracting with a life of their own. He stepped further into the garden, his steps muffled by the soft earth beneath him. A low whisper reached his ears, like a distant murmur, as though the plants were speaking in a language he couldn't quite understand. He turned in a slow circle, his heart racing. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and sickly, like overripe fruit. But there was something more, something ancient and wrong. Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in the garden. The whispering grew louder, as if the plants were calling to him, urging him to come closer. His feet carried him deeper, past strange mushrooms that glowed faintly in the shadows, and trees with bark that seemed to pulse like veins. It was then that he saw her. In the center of the garden, standing by a gnarled oak tree, was a woman. She was tall and thin, dressed in a flowing black gown that seemed to blend with the darkness around her. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, large and dark, locked onto his as though she had been waiting for him. "Do you like my garden?" she asked, her voice soft, yet carrying an unsettling authority. "I've tended it for so long." Benjamin's mouth went dry, but he couldn't look away. "It's beautiful," he said, though his words felt hollow, as if they weren't his own. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold, like the smile of someone who knew a secret too terrible to share. "It is," she agreed, stepping closer. "But it's more than just a garden. It's a place where things are trapped, things that shouldn't be. You see, I've used it for years. It feeds me, and I feed it. A fair trade, don't you think?" Benjamin felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wanted to turn and run, but his body felt heavy, like something was pulling him toward her. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. "You've been drawn here," she continued, her voice hypnotic, "just as others have been before you. The garden has a way of calling to those who need something to fill the empty places inside of them." Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and Benjamin felt a wave of nausea rush over him. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he looked down at the plants around him. He could see now that their movement wasn't random. The vines, the flowers, they were reaching toward him. The air felt thicker, as if the garden itself was alive, pulsing with an energy that was both intoxicating and terrifying. "The souls of those who wandered too far into my garden are here," the witch said softly, her voice like a caress. "The plants feed on them, their life force nourishing the soil. They live on, trapped in the roots, in the leaves, in the very air you breathe. I've been here for centuries, feeding my magic, keeping myself alive." Benjamin's heart pounded in his chest. What do you want from me?" he managed to ask. The witch's smile widened, and for a moment Benjamin saw something in her eyes, something that made him feel small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for you to stay, to be part of the garden. You see, once you've come here, you can never truly leave. The garden knows you now, and once it knows you, it will never let you go." Benjamin stumbled back, panic rising in his chest. But as he turned to run, something stopped him. The vines, the flowers, they were moving again, but this time they were wrapping around him. He tried to pull away, but the plants tightened, their grip like iron. The garden was holding him, its roots digging into his flesh. "No!" he screamed, struggling to break free, but the more he fought, the more the plants seemed to pull him in. "I don't want this." But the witch's voice echoed in his mind. "You're already mine, Benjamin. You've always been mine. You cannot leave." His body went cold as the vines began to close in around him. The air grew thick, the whispering voices louder, more frantic. They were calling to him, urging him to stay, to become one with the garden. He could feel it now, the pull, the hunger of the earth beneath him, the desire of the plants to consume him, to add his soul to the collection they had already claimed. And as the world around him darkened, Benjamin realized that he had never truly stood a chance. The garden had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him. And now he would be part of it, his soul forever trapped in the roots of the witch's garden, feeding its dark magic for eternity. The last thing he heard before the garden swallowed him whole was the witch's voice, laughing softly in the wind. "You're home now.